Vijaya.
Please take a seat. Thank you.
Vijaya. Oh,
Okay. Thank you. That was the longest 15 minutes. C'est 15 minutes mauricien, ça. Okay. Welcome back. We have one last item on our agenda for this morning's opening ceremony. Last, but definitely not least, let's welcome Professor Emeritus Edward Alpers from UCLA for his address. Professor Alpers will communicate on slavery and the slave trade in the Western Indian Ocean and historiography, retrospect, and prospect. Professor, the floor is yours. No, yours is here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I was worried that as many of the dignitaries who are here this morning were still going to be here for my talk, and I'd have to remember everything. And I would I say at the end, all protocols observed? But since Miriam is, I think, the only one here, thank you. Greetings, Honorable Director. So I can get rid of the first 2 pages. Let me start. On this 30th anniversary of the UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project, we should remember that this is not the first time that UNESCO has held an important academic meeting here in Mauritius. Half a century ago, in July 1974, as part of the drafting of a general history of Africa, UNESCO organized a meeting of experts that produced a book called Historical Relations Across the Indian Ocean. Neither slavery nor the slave trade received serious attention at this meeting. In short, the field was wide open for a new generation of historians. What I will say today echoes several recent and substantial overviews of slavery and the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, so that issues I identify and historians whom I name will be familiar to many in the field. But I must warn you all that my talk includes many names, a hazard of an historiographical approach. And while these overviews reflect the multiple origins of those who were enslaved in the Indian Ocean world, most of my talk will focus on Africa and Africans. For as Richard Allen, it's right over here, has observed, quote, "The history of Africans in the Indian Ocean is inextricably intertwined with slavery and slave trading," end quote. So let's begin with the legacy of abolitionism and British imperialism. The modern historiography on slavery and the slave trade in the Indian Ocean has its origins in the abolition movement that came to focus on Eastern Africa and the Western Indian Ocean after Great Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. In 1967, I published a revisionist pamphlet on the East African slave trade for the Historical Association of Tanzania. My astonishment continues to be cited in literature. My astonishment because it's 6 years old. In it, I began by debunking claims by British imperial historian Sir Reginald Coupland regarding the antiquity of slavery and the slave trade in East Africa. Coupland's perspective was shaped by more than a century of abolitionist narratives that assigned all responsibility for enslaving to anyone other than the British, be they African, Arab, Portuguese, French, Brazilian, Spanish, or American. In this moral narrative, Africans were either pitiable victims or ruthless enslavers, working in collaboration with these foreign traffickers. This perspective endured in publications through the colonial period in East Africa, and actually in a number afterwards. In the last 6 decades, however, historical studies of slavery and the slave trade in the wider Indian Ocean have proliferated and matured, reflecting both the unprecedented growth of scholarship on global slavery and the rise of Indian Ocean world studies. Coupland's interest in abolition in the Omani Sultanate of Zanzibar was rooted in his understanding of British imperialism in the Indian Ocean. Even Raymond Beechey's 1976 starting point, as he called his book on the slave trade of Eastern Africa, was still focused on the British role in abolition. A year earlier, Moses Mulia provided an unambiguous critique of British imperialism and the interpretation of abolition in East Africa offered by Coupland. There is, he wrote, and I quote, sufficient evidence to show that her humanitarianism, as exemplified in British official attitudes and policies towards slavery and the slave trade in East Africa, was more the humanitarianism of self-interest than of anything else, end quote. Fair enough. Now let's have a look at how works by Frederick Cooper and Abdul Sharif reflected the theoretical orientations of a new generation of historians of Africa from the 1970s and created new perspectives on the Swahili coast. Cooper's focus as a social historian of labor marks a radical break in studies of Zanzibar and the Swahili coast. As he writes in the preface to his 1977 book, Plantation Slavery on the East Coast of Africa, quote, "This is a study of how Africans and Arabs living on Africa's east coast used slave labor to build a plantation economy, and of the society that developed from the meeting and confrontation of masters and slaves," end quote. In 1987, Abdul Sharif published his equally groundbreaking study, Slaves, Spices, and Ivory in Zanzibar, a neo-Marxist political economy which more than in any previous study expanded the conceptual boundaries of Omani Zanzibar. Sharif and Cooper hold differing interpretations of the emergence of plantation slavery in Zanzibar, but together, their seminal contributions have paved the way for subsequent historians of slavery in East Africa. First among these is Jonathan Glassman's influential analysis of the massive 1888 uprising in the coastal towns of German East Africa, which rests on his subtle analysis of coastal slavery. Yet for these and other important monographs, the study of slavery and the slave trade remains a sensitive subject in East Africa. Nevertheless, Felicitas Becker and Salvatore Nianto, who's with us at this conference, have each addressed this issue for Tanzania. Herman Kiriyama and Marie-Pierre Ballaran, again with us, have led the way for coastal Kenya. Kiriyama, in the last decade, Henri Médard, Wilson Marshall, and Thomas Vernet Habas surveys on slavery in the Indian Ocean, while Becker has surveyed emancipation in East Africa. So there's been a lot of work. Let me now turn away from Zanzibar and the Swahili coast to the adjoining subregion of the Southwest Indian Ocean. The expansion of the slave trade from Mozambique and the parallel growth of slavery in Zambezia date only to the 18th century. In 1967, James Duffy published the first serious study of slavery and the slave trade in Portuguese Africa, but his chapters on Mozambique maintained a direct historiographical line to British abolitionism. Soon, however, a new generation of Anglophone scholars were beginning to explore the archival holdings of both Portugal and its colonial territories to understand this history. Malanuit demonstrated the centrality of slavery on the Portuguese Zambezi Brazos and the growing significance of the slave trade at the end of the 18th century. Alan Isaacman combined archive research with extensive field work, collecting oral accounts of the past about the Africanization of the Brazos. Although both books focus on the development of the Brazos, slavery and the slave trade are essential elements in their arguments about Zambezia. In Ivory and Slaves, I developed a regional history of East Central Africa that reached beyond the coastal boundaries of Portuguese control to Zanzibar and deep into the African interior. Nancy Hafkin's unpublished dissertation on the principal Swahili polities in 19th century northern Mozambique weaves a story of how the slave trade was the key factor in the rise of the sultanates and their opposition to the imposition of effective colonial rule at the end of the century. Until José Capella began to research slavery and the slave trade in Mozambique, Portuguese historiography concentrated on imperial and colonial politics. In the late 1980s, Eduardo Medeiros published a short book that provides an overview of the slave trade in northern Mozambique. Capella subsequently published a series of important books on different aspects of slavery and the slave trade in colonial Mozambique, most notably O Tráfico de Escravos nos Portos de Moçambique. It remains an invaluable source for anyone studying the slave trade from Mozambique. Among Mozambicans, slavery and the slave trade remain largely unexamined, except for the notable work of Benigna Zimba, that's here. The most important study in the current century is undoubtedly that by Alan and Barbara Isaacman on the Chikunda of Zambezia. The significance accorded to the slave trade and slavery, however, is also examined in the work of South African Pedro Machado, Brazilian Regiana Augusta de Matos, Portuguese Filipe Ribeiro da Silva, Italian Francesca de Clich, and Swiss Andreas Zeman. And I add those nationalities because one of the factors is that this is very much an international undertaking. Although the principal demand for enslaved labor from Mozambique emanated from the Mascarenes, we know that the French island plantation economies of Ile Bourbon and Ile-de-France were not the only destinations of so-called Mozambiques in the Southwest Indian Ocean. So let's look at South Africa. In 1979, James Armstrong inaugurated a vigorous tradition of slavery studies in South Africa. A generation of South African historians soon followed. Led by Nigel Worden, Andrew Bank, Robert Schell, and Wayne Dooling, they produced an important body of scholarship on slavery in South Africa. Pamela Scully and John Edwin Mason each examined aspects of emancipation at the Cape. And Carl Schoeman reconstructed the early history of slavery in the Cape Colony. In 2005, Worden and Gerald Grunewald published a set of important 18th century documents on slaves from the criminal records at the Cape, while Schell joined forces with Sandra Roald Schell and Mogamat Comedian to produce an invaluable bibliography on slavery and abolition in South Africa. The heritage of slavery in South Africa is challenged in recent books by literary theorist Nienke Boer and cultural activist Patrick Terry Mellet. It should come as no surprise, however, that coming to grips with the after effects, les séquelles, of slavery in South Africa remains an unresolved social dilemma. Terry Ward and Nigel Worden raised the issue of how slavery was remembered, or not, at the end of the 1990s. And a recent paper by Samuel North makes clear that the issue has not gone away. Nevertheless, except for Schell, relatively little attention has been devoted to the slave trade that brought outsiders to South Africa and Mary Ward, among others, has vividly demonstrated the complexity of how the Dutch East Indies Company met its labor needs at the Cape through a combination of importing convicts, political exiles, and slaves from across the Indian Ocean world. Shell also produced a short essay on the early slave trade from Maputo to Cape Town, which is in the History, Memory, and Identity book. Patrick Harris notably probed the history of so-called Mozambicans in South Africa and the details of the slave trade that carried them from various ports in Portuguese East Africa to the Cape. Preben Carlsson, who's also here, has addressed issues of memory and heritage among the liberated African community of Zanzibar, Makua of Natal. Having clung to the African coast, now is the time to sail forth into the Southwest Indian Ocean. French involvement in the slave trade from East Africa to the Mascarenes was presented to academic Africanists by G.S.P. Freeman Grendel's book by both J.M. Filio. 2 decades later, Capella joined forces with to write a valuable book in Portuguese on the slave trade from Mozambique to the Mascarenes that was first published in Maputo. In 1985, they presented it to a major conference on slavery in the Southwest Indian Ocean at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute here in Mauritius. Before we reach the Mascarenes, however, let's pause to consider the slave trade and slavery in the Mozambique Channel. Jean Martin and I studied the early 19th century maritime Malagasy raids on the Comoros and the East African coast, the object of which was to acquire slaves. In the 1980s, Gwyn Campbell published pioneering essays on slaving in Madagascar and the Southwest Indian Ocean that provide a solid platform for the study of the slave trade in the Mozambique Channel, while his comprehensive economic history summarizes his previous work on slave trade, slavery, and forced labor in imperial Madagascar. Jill Shepard's essay on the place of the Comoros in the East African slave trade has been supplemented by Sophie Blanchy, while Siti Yahya has shown us the possibilities of oral traditions in the archives of Mayotte. More recently, senior Comorian scholar Ali Tabibu Iburoy published a massive historical sociology of slavery in the Comoros that analyzes history and memory in Volume 1 and the influence of the enslaved Makua and their descendants in Volume 2. Thomas Verne Habask has revealed the significance of the slave trade from Madagascar to the Swahili coast in Arabia before the 19th century, while Raphael Tiabo has examined Inyas Rakoto edited a volume of collection of papers from a conference hosted by the Université de Toamasine that debated the slave trade from eastern Madagascar. Pierre Larsen's study of history and memory in the age of enslavement is fundamental for the period before the well-known Anglo-American Treaty of 1820 that sought to ban export trade from Madagascar. Larsen's innovative use of oral sources and contemporary memories of slavery has been followed by both anthropologists and historians in Madagascar. Denis Grenier and Dominique Somda have considered slavery and post-slavery in Madagascar as a whole, while Campbell and Jane Hooper have each made valuable contributions to the Oxford Research Encyclopedias on slavery, slave trade, and the Malagasy diaspora in the Indian Ocean. So sitting between coastal East Africa and the Mascarenes, there can be no doubting that Madagascar played a central role as both importer and exporter of enslaved labor in the Western Indian Ocean. The 1985 conference here in Mauritius also brought together the first generation of Francophone scholars who researched both national and regional archives to reconstruct the history and legacy of slavery in the Mascarenes. Hubert Gerbeau was central to this cohort. From the 1960s, Gerbeau was the driving force behind the pursuit of local history at the Université de la Réunion and the mentor of leading Réunionnais historians of slavery, Prosper Eve and Sudel Fumo. In 1979, he published an influential paper as part of the UNESCO General History of Africa project that outlined the challenges facing historians of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Gerbeau's characterization of the history of silence
of Afro-Malagasy Mauritians entitled Breaking the Wall of Silence that foreshadowed an outpouring of research on slavery and its aftermath in Mauritius. Subsequently, Carl Noel, Anthony Barker, Derek Storer, T-Lock, and Richard Allen each grappled with different aspects of slavery and abolition in Mauritius. In the last decade, Peter Nichols has substantially added to our knowledge of slavery in the Seychelles. In 2001, T-Lock and I co-edited a collection of papers that explored questions of memory and identity arising from the history of slavery and the slave trade that stimulated continuing interest locally and apparently caused us to have a second edition that just came out. Megan Vaughn examined in detail the formative role of slavery in the 18th century and the roots of Creole society. Megan's here as well. The Malagasy contribution to creolization of the masquerades is the subject of Pierre Larson's exceptional analysis of Malagasy epistolary culture, Ocean Letters. William Rosal has begun to document the lives of liberated Mozambicans in the masquerades
that draws upon the extensive family archive of 19th century French ethnographer Eugène de Froberville. And as the program for this international conference makes evident, the continuing leadership of Ijaya T-Lock has generated both international and local research into the many shades of slavery and its heritage in Mauritius. For his part, Richard Allen has energetically promoted the study of slavery and the European slave trade in the Indian Ocean, with the masquerades at the center of his research. His essay on plantation slavery in the Mascarenes for the ever-expanding Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History offers an invaluable introduction to this topic. Finally, local publications by Marina Carter and several collaborators on liberated Africans also deserve mention, as does the prolific Benjamin Mutu's book on the economic heritage of slavery. Leaving the Mascarenes for a moment, let's follow the southwest monsoon and turn to the northwest Indian Ocean. Although slavery and slave trading were ancient practices in Ethiopia, Eritrea, modern scholarship was slow to investigate their history. Richard Pankhurst paved the way in the 1960s with valuable descriptive chapters of the slave trade. Because of the late abolition of slavery and its traffic in Ethiopia, most attention subsequently focused on the modern era. In 1988, William Gervais Clarence Smith edited a critical collection of essays on the economics of the Indian Ocean slave trade in the 19th century. It included a trio of eye-opening papers by Janet Ewalt, Abu Samad Ahmad, and Timothy Fernyhough that illuminated our knowledge of slave trade outlets from the Nile Valley in Ethiopia to the Red Sea. Ewalt also drew scholarly attention to the sea. Slavery remains one of the blind spots in the historiography of the Horn of Africa in general and Ethiopia in particular, end quote. Their joint contributions on slavery, slave trade, and emancipation in Ethiopia and Eritrea to the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History represents their responses to this challenge. Research on the Red Sea trade is equally sparse, not least because of what Jonathan Mirren calls, quote, a notably weak evidentiary base. Nor is the situation better for Arabia, where the ancient presence of Africans, both free and enslaved, has been largely silenced. Benjamin Riley's environmental analysis of agricultural slavery in Arabia is a stimulating exception that enables him, quote, to describe in as much detail as the sources permit a system of slave and servile labor employing mainly sub-Saharan Africans, which prevailed in the traditional Arabian Peninsula, end quote. And Magdalena Murti-Klaas has thrown open the study of slavery in medieval Arabia and Yemen in a stream of fundamental publications. If the Red Sea represents a maritime western boundary to the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf, whether it's called Persian or Arabian, is equally its watery eastern frontier. When Great Britain pushed its imperial nose into the waters of the Gulf, scholarship on slavery and the slave trade in the Gulf reflected the familiar British attitudes of British abolitionism and the domination of regional imperial history over the questions about slavery that concern us here today. From my perspective, it was Abdul Sharif's analysis of Omani Zanzibar that charted the way forward for studies of slavery and the slave trade in the Gulf. In 1988, Thomas Ricks wrote on slaves and slavers in the Gulf, while the change in the broader historiography can be seen in essays included in the 2013 Yale publication of Indian Ocean Slavery in the Age of Abolition. Matthew Hopper's book, Slaves of One Master, was the first in-depth historical analysis of slavery in Arabia in its global dimensions. Banaj Mirzai pioneered the study of slavery and emancipation in Iran during the long 19th century. Jerzy Zudnowski adopted a comparative view of slavery and manumission in the Red Sea and the Gulf in the first half of the 20th century. Most recently, Hideaki Suzuki, who's here, published a valuable overview on enslaved Africans in the Gulf, while his article on the so-called myth of mild slavery in the Gulf echoes Prosper Ev's thoughts regarding la douceur de l'esclavage on Réunion. We turn to India. The foundational work for Africanists is Joseph Harris's 1971 book, The African Presence in Asia. Harris was inspired by his participation in an international conference on the African abroad or the African diaspora at the University College of Dar es Salaam in 1965, where he noted, quote, "What especially impressed me was the almost complete lack of information on the dispersion of Africans in Asia," end quote. Over time, Harris became the leading figure in promoting scholarship on the global African diaspora. Indeed, until recently, most subsequent studies of the African presence in Asia have reflected his diasporic influence. Although Harris could draw upon a handful of earlier history of African Indians by Indian writers, the works since then have been published in the current century. Valuable collections of essays edited by Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya and Richard Pankhurst, and by Kenneth Robbins and John MacLeod are good examples of such collaborative efforts. The recruitment and employment of military slaves, primarily from war-torn Northeast Africa and the Swahili coast, dominate most accounts, not least because of the contrast to Atlantic slavery. Still, diaspora remains the central organizing principle for these projects. The rise of several gifted enslaved African leaders who operated in the Deccan states of Ahmadnagar and Bijapur in the 17th century occupy a special place in this literature. Among these elite Africans is the enslaved Habshi, Malik Ambar, to whom Harris devoted a chapter, who continues to draw the most attention. Richard Eaton embeds his analysis of Ambar in the wider context of elite slavery in India, while Omar Ali sets his short biography in that of power and slavery across the Indian Ocean. Jaya Surya's various publications, including her own work on Africans in Sri Lanka, offer a wider perspective on Africans in Asia. Finally, one way to bring us back to the Western Indian Ocean slave trade is to recognize that the enslaved included not only Africans, as Gwyn Campbell has reminded us on several occasions, but also Indians, as Richard Allen has carefully demonstrated. Having reached the point in my presentation where I discuss some future directions for research, I must admit that virtually all of these have their roots in recent research by many of the scholars whose names I have all invoked, some of whom are here today. And as I hope I have demonstrated, it should be obvious that the collective effort to address slavery and the slave trade in the Western Indian Ocean involves a galaxy of international scholars based around the globe. I should also acknowledge that I have said almost nothing about the movement of enslaved Indians, Indonesians, or Chinese to the European colonial economies of the Western Indian Ocean. In any event, 4 areas of continuing research that I want to briefly address are the archaeology of slavery and the slave trade, giving voice to the enslaved, quantification and the creation of databases, and heritage and memory. First, let's look at the archaeology of slavery and the slave trade. If identifying slavery in the archaeological record has been called elusive, it has also been suggested that, quote, slavery need not be invisible. In 2004, Chaparuka Kusimba published a groundbreaking essay on the archaeology of slavery in East Africa. This was soon followed by Jonathan Waltz and Stephen Brandt's wide-ranging chapter, quote, towards an archaeology of the other African diaspora, the slave trade and dispersed Africans in the Western Indian Ocean. In 2011, Paul Lane and Kevin MacDonald edited a volume on the intersection of archaeology and memory in the study of slavery in Africa that included essays covering topics from Northeast to South Africa. In 2018, a special issue of the new Journal of African Diaspora Archaeology and Heritage on landscapes of slavery in Africa included contributions on Kenya and Mauritius. 2 years later, a special issue of the journal Azania, Archaeological Research in Africa, on slavery and unfree labor in Africa included contributions on Tanzania, Mauritius, and by Stefania Monfio and Jan van Arnhem on maritime archaeology of slave ships, with a focus on Mauritius and the Indian Ocean. And we'll see more of that later. Parallel research on slave wrecks in Mozambique dates to 2013. Amitava Chowdhury and Krish Sita have written about maroon archaeological research in Mauritius with a focus on Le Morne Brabant. This evening, we will learn more about this work at the launching of an exhibition on archaeological research on slavery in Mauritius 2002-2023 at the Mauritius Museum Council. Lydia Wilson-Marshall on maroon archaeology for Kenya. She has also written an overview of the link between the archaeology and the heritage of slavery in East Africa for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History. Yet while this accounting reveals that a good beginning has been achieved, much, much more remains to be done on the archaeological front. A second area of research is the felt need to give voice to the enslaved. In fact, this was a strategy of 19th century abolitionists and missionaries to raise both public awareness and funds to support abolition and the missions. But as Matthew Hopper and I have argued, speaking for themselves is complicated by questions of translation and the perspective of the persons who recorded such testimonies. Over the past half century, individual historians have struggled as best they can both to understand and present such voices and to identify and tease out fragments of their stories from obscure sources. A personal example from 1983 recounts the story of Swema, an enslaved Yao girl whose captive journey from northern Mozambique to Kilwa and on to Zanzibar, and in fact, finally on to Réunion, where she died, was recorded and presented by a French Spiritan missionary in 1870. More recently, Zdanowski's book, Speaking with Their Own Voices, is based on manumission records from British agencies in the Gulf. British Protector of Slaves records have been a parallel source for African voices in Mauritius, South Africa too, during the transition from slavery to indenture. The edited collection titled Being a Slave is notable for including examples from across the Western Indian Ocean. 3 different cases of giving voice to enslaved Africans by carefully reading colonial court records are by Megan Vaughan for 18th century Mauritius, by Matthias van Rossum and colleagues for 18th century Cochin, India, and by Sue Peabody for the twice captured French slaver Succès in the 1820s. Peabody's award-winning book, Madeleine's Children, reconstructs the history of one enslaved mascarene family. Giuseppe Marcocci and Ananya Chakravarti have drawn upon late 16th century Inquisition records from India to reconstruct the extraordinary story of the enslaved Abyssinian named Gabriel. Anthony Lee has recreated the life of Ziba Khanum, an enslaved African woman in 19th century Iran, from family records, both written and oral. Although the study of slavery is above all an aspect of labor history, we need to recognize that the enslaved also had lives of the mind. Ahmed al-Mazmi's close reading of Omani jurist Nasir bin Abi Naban's occult writings brilliantly enables him to extract the parallel knowledge of enslaved East Africans in 19th century Omani Empire. Dorrit Brixius has convincingly demonstrated the importance of how the acquired knowledge of enslaved Indians and Africans transformed agriculture in 18th century Mauritius. And Eugenia Rodrigues has revealed ways in which the medical plant knowledge of enslaved Mozambicans became incorporated in Goa and Mauritius. Certainly, other examples exist, but these alone should indicate the many possibilities that remain to be located in these kinds of archives. Let me now talk about quantification and database creation, perhaps the most challenging area of future research. Everyone who writes about slavery and the slave trade tries to determine its dimensions. For the Atlantic world, quantification became a major academic industry following the 1969 of Philip Curtin's magisterial census, the major product being the Transatlantic Slave Database, today accessible online at slavevoyages.com. But even as Abdul Sharif cautions us not to become enmeshed in an Atlantic framework, we must appreciate that quantification, that Western record keeping was not systematically maintained by these historical actors. The 2 essential compilations, Slave Trade from Indian Ocean, Africa, and by Richard Allen for the European slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Both books are now a decade old, and researchers continue to seek new data in both official and unofficial archives globally. Since 2016, a group of committed historians based at the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam and spearheaded by project leaders Ulbe Bosma and Matthias van Rossum have collaborated to create an international database on the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, Asia, called Exploring Slave Trade in Asia, or ESTA. In 2 publications, they have laid out a set of parameters for this database and described some of the lessons they have learned in building it. There'll be a further paper in this conference about it. They have also created a website that invites visitors to contribute and includes discrete databases that have already been added to this ambitious project. More recently, a team led by Richard Allen, Daniel Dominguez de Silva, Jane Hooper and Matthew Hopper have inaugurated a database project of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asia that will be linked to slave voyages. Although some might see these two projects as rivals, I believe they are complementary. I'm an optimist. Moreover, it is worth noting that both Hooper and Silva, who manages slave voyages, have contributed databases to ESTA, while Allen has also been involved. So it will be interesting, to say the least, to see how future collaboration between these two database projects develops. I'd like to end with some reflections on heritage and memory. The legacy of enslavement casts a long shadow over the littoral societies of the Western Indian Ocean as elsewhere. Still, coming to grips historically with that legacy has opened a path to demand for recognition, affirmation, and in some cases, reparation for that history. Earlier, I noted the significance of this struggle in South Africa. Recently, issues of heritage and tourism have become prominent in both Kenya and Tanzania, as well as in Qatar, where the Museum of Slavery in Belgelmode House in Doha is part of the tourist circuit. Music, dance, and song have long been recognized as important means of expression to convey memories of enslavement, as in Mauritian Sega or Reunione Maloya, but also in folk songs of the Cape Coloreds or those of slave descendants in southern Somalia. Imaginative literature, both as novels and poetry, enables writers and readers to gain access to the emotional complexities of enslavement. Three powerful examples of how novels can transform our understanding of slavery are Tanzanian Nobel laureate Abdulrazak Gurna's Paradise, South African Yvette Christensen's Unconfessed, and Omani Joka Alharthi's Celestial Bodies. In the Mascarenes, novels of marronage have often been at the center of regional literature. The poetry of South African Gaborone Badarone evokes haunting memories of slavery in unexpected places. Another method for capturing memories of slavery is film, as we shall see for ourselves later in this conference in the screening of Joël Valerie's film, Mangalo, 240 years later, which we got a snippet of, and Simone Muteru's film, Ni Chaîne ni Maître. My talk today has featured the scholarly contributions of scores of historians and social scientists across several generations, working from various theoretical and methodological perspectives and based in many different countries. The historiographical approach that I have adopted shows the many layers of scholarship that reveal the rich history of research on slavery and the slave trade in the Western Indian Ocean. We have surely accomplished much, yet much more remains to be done. For this is a terrible history, and we must never forget or neglect. It is my hope that this conference and other contributions that will surely follow will continue to build on the work of the UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project as we continue to excavate and educate about the history and legacies of slavery and the slave trade globally. So let me end here in Mauritius, where issues of heritage and memory have focused on Le Morne, Brabant as a refuge for runaway slaves and the campaign to secure UNESCO World Heritage Site recognition. Numerous publications in French, English, and Creole over the past 2 decades bear witness to the public interest in Le Morne. When you visit Le Morne, your first impression is of Brabant, the rocky outcrop that rises abruptly above the coast in the Indian Ocean. But across the way, in the shadow of Brabant, is the old cemetery, which has yielded valuable information on those who were buried there. It is a moving sight for all who care to engage with the past. Let me conclude then by quoting a stanza from a poem by contemporary British poet Lee Knowles, who visited Mauritius in 2022. You show me your old slave cemetery, 2 centuries overgrown, abandoned now, except for belief that spirits still linger, earthed in living memory, lives and memories still there to be tended, acknowledged, revered, and how other faiths have adopted your customs of remembrance. In this, the past lives on in the present, true meaning and benevolence shining. Thank you very much. I think I've almost put us back on time.
Thank you, Professor Alpert. Sorry. Thank you for this very truly informative, thoughtful, and insightful address. I invite our conference delegates to use the knowledge shared by Professor Alpert as a basis when engaging in the diverse conversations this conference aims to bring. Dear audience, let us thank together again Professor Alpert and all of today's speakers. Special thanks to His Excellency, who not only honored us with his presence and input as the President of the Republic of Mauritius, but also engaged with us from his remarkable scholarly perspective. On that note, I conclude this morning's ceremony and invite the delegates. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the conference.